Baby, all I want for Christmas is tequila. Yep, that's it. Hey, I'm BXL. It's super nice to meet you. Welcome to my channel. If you clicked on this video, I'm assuming you love Christmas and you love Halloween, which is great because we totally have that in common. Even then, I do want to give a little background as to how this idea came about. So my friends and I decided to get together for Christmas, and we decided to make it a costume party. Now, originally, we were going to go as different characters from Christmas lore. So for example, Frosty the Snowman, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Santa, all these different classics. But since we were doing costumes, we got on the topic of how we haven't been able to celebrate Halloween together for a while. Then we were like, we're doing both. So then we started popping off, talking about all these ways that we could make Christmas a little bit scary. Now, to be fair, Christmas is already a little bit scary. Watching your relatives argue at the dinner table, pretty scary. Realizing at the end of the year that you haven't accomplished as much as you should have, terrifying. Not to mention that the whole premise of Santa revolves around a man trespassing into your home via chimney. That is just the premise of a horror movie. But anyways, I ended up designing and making 7 costumes that 1, matched all my friends' vibes, 2, incorporated an element of Christmas, and 3, incorporated an element of Halloween. So here is the concept sketch for The Nightmare Before Christmas. And I'll talk a little bit about each individual outfit later. Alright, it's later. So I'm gonna start with my friend Aurora. Aurora's vibe is like total insta-baddie. She's getting the likes, she's getting the followers, and she's doing the most. So definitely had to have an outfit that represented that. Now, in terms of incorporating Christmas, I decided to kind of put in an angel influence. And then in terms of incorporating Halloween, I decided to go with kind of like a half-possessed devil situation, almost like Cruella. So the dress together is a halo, a wing, and a mini skirt that is half black and half white. First off, let's talk about the halo. So the first thing I did was use some wire to create the shape of the halo, and then I wrapped it around a headband. Then I basically kind of duct taped everything together and then hot glued black velvet and some white faux fur onto the halo to create the whole thing. Now, I guess moving on to the wings, same thing. I used wire to shape the wings and then did a similar thing where I covered the wings in duct tape and fabric, this time using black velvet and white velvet. Then I had some feathers and I glued them on with E6000. The last thing I did was turn this wing situation into a choker by cutting out a strip of black and white fabric and then adding snap fasteners onto the back of the wings so that you could wear it as a necklace. Side note, wear eye protection while you were doing this. I think I almost poked my eye out like 8 times, so probably not the best idea to do this like without goggles. Now for the actual dress. So in terms of material, I used black and white spandex, partially because the cleanliness of the fabric accentuates the shape of the dress, but also because it's more forgiving if I mess up since the fabric stretches. I'm not even gonna lie. So I got Aurora's measurements and I sketched out her body type on paper in order to make a pattern. Note, for a normal dress, you can just make a front and a back and sew it together, but because I was making the dress half black and half white, I had to use 4 pieces. So 2 for the front and 2 for the back. So I traced the pieces and cut them all out onto spandex. You're seeing 8 pieces because I actually made a second copy of the dress to use as a line, just to give the dress a little bit more body. Then I took the rectangular pieces of spandex I cut out and sewed them into a tube, which I flipped inside out to make a spaghetti strap. Lastly, I attached everything together and that was the dress. So overall, I think that this was a pretty successful costume. You could definitely tell the visual effect that I was going for, and the fit was pretty nice. Also, I made it onto her Insta story, so I'm gonna count that as a win. Moving on to Kaylee. Kaylee is this super bubbly and positive girl, and the last time that Kaylee and I actually went out for Halloween, she wore a costume that was super kind of like Hansel and Gretel vibes, which is neat, and I basically wanted to continue that trend here. The Christmas influence was a gingerbread girl. I combined that with the Halloween influence of a voodoo doll. I basically took inspiration from a YouTuber named Crafterpreneur here, who made this super cool voodoo doll costume as well, and here's how I put it together. So overall, this dress is is pretty much a cute brown dress with some puffy sleeves, some white piping, pins, a heart stitched in the center, and then a candy cane shiv. Making the candy cane shiv was pretty easy. It was basically shaping the shiv with some wire, some duct tape, and some foam, classic. And then I hot glued some more red and white foam onto the base in order to finally get the candy cane effect. Moving on to the voodoo pins. Basically, that was me hot gluing dowels into styrofoam spheres and then painting over the pins in black and gray. Now for the actual dress, I basically made two back pieces and attached them together with a zipper. Then I attached that to the front. Then I made a skirt out of a front piece and a back piece that were attached together as well. Then I had a top piece, a bottom piece, sewed it together, and I added an elastic so that the dress would come together at the waist. Also, I added some white ribbon onto the edges just to give that icing effect. So the next thing I did was add the sleeves. I don't know how to explain this, but sleeve pieces look like this. There's like a curve to it at the top. I'm not sure why. I think that's just to kind of give some room for the shoulder. But usually the length of the curve will be close to the size of the armhole. But in order to make a puffy sleeve, you actually have to make the curve a little bit bigger. And then what you do is you sew a line through that curve and then gather it until it matches the size of the armhole. Then you sew it in. So I did that. I hemmed the sleeve and added elastic to the sleeve to give it an even puffier effect. Lastly, I hot glued the red heart onto the dress and then I stitched it all together with some black string. And honestly, this looked pretty scary, especially when we started doing the light flickering and with the candy cane shiv. It looks super fun, and I think the only thing that was missing from it was a twin to give it more of like the shining vibes. So next up, let me talk about Char's look. So Char probably has one of my favorite aesthetics of the bunch. It's kind of streetwear influenced, and they also have this really distinct interest in anime, and so I really wanted to channel that into this look as well. So for the Christmas influence, I actually brought in Jack Frost. And for the Halloween influence, I brought in a little bit of the anime Demon Slayer. So overall, this fit consists of a light blue robe with a white belt, and then some harem pants that are a little bit baggy to give it that streetwear vibe. For actually making the robe, all I did was trace a t-shirt, then I cut out the pattern and then traced it onto some fabric. So the back piece is actually one piece, but the front piece is cut in half because that's the opening of the robe. Once that was done, I sewed it all together, and I was a little bit frustrated for a second because I realized I had just made scrubs. I look like a surgeon. I'm not even gonna deny it. Like, you could put me as an extra in Grey's Anatomy in that moment and no one would be the wiser. But that's okay because we were about to add a belt. So the belt is basically just made of white felt, which I cut to be about 1.5 times longer than Char's waist. And then I added some slits a quarter of the way in on each side so that you could insert it and then tie it from the back. Then to make the pants. So to make the actual pants, I cut out two pieces of fabric that kind of looked like a shorter, wider version of the Eiffel Tower, and then basically just sew them together. And then at the waist, I added an elastic, and then same thing at the ankles. Now, overall, I think this look was pretty simple, but it was accessorized really well because, again, Char is a complete style guru. With the nunchucks, the snowflake earrings, the white long sleeve turtleneck, and the chunky white shoes, this look actually gave this sick combination of anime style and streetwear, and it was actually one of the more successful ones. So moving on to Kirk's dress. Kirk's dress, or should I say gown, really reflects their completely feminine, regal, supermodel vibes, which is awesome. So the Christmas element of this dress is Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and the Halloween element is just general gore. Rudolph had a rough night, rib cage exposed, all that stuff. So overall, this dress is pretty much just a brown column dress with some antlers and then an exposed rib cage in the chest area. So for actually making the antlers, again, it's shaping the antlers with wire and then adding some duct tape and foam in order to put everything together. But this time what I did was I paper machéd over it, I think a couple of layers, and then I painted the antlers to give it accuracy that we needed. Now for the rib cage, I don't know if any of you Chinese people out there know when you get those like New Year calendars and then it's been hanging on your wall for a few years and like it's still there for some reason. I took the back of one of those to make the base of the rib cage because it was weirdly sturdy but also weirdly flexible, and it was kind of perfect for this purpose. Then I sketched out out pretty much where I thought the ribs and the organs should be, and I added some foam in order to add some dimension to the whole thing. The last thing I did was paper mache everything and then paint everything over. So for actually making the dress, the fabric that I used was this stretchy sequined brown suede, and it added a little bit of sparkle and texture that made the dress a little bit glamorous, which was super fun. Basically, to actually make the dress, I traced a t-shirt that Kirk sent me and then added some length in order to make the dress hit the floor. So as you can see, the front piece was one piece and then the back piece was two pieces so that I could sew the back pieces together and attach a zipper in the center. Once the back piece was put together, I took the back and the front and then I sewed those together. Then I traced out some sleeves and I sewed those in. The last thing I did was hot glue the rib cage onto the inside of the dress where the chest was, and I cut out the chest to reveal the rib cage. I think this was pretty successful. The horror vibes really came through with this one. I will say the antlers were a bit of an issue because they kept falling off. It's probably unrealistic to expect something so heavy to stay on one's head, but hey. So then I guess moving on to mine, in terms of vibe, I don't know if I have one. I was listening to a lot of like Olivia Rodrigo and Paramore this year. That's where this kind of influence is coming from. So for Christmas, I chose Elf, and then basically for the Halloween aspect, I turned it into a punk elf. So basically for the actual costume, I made a green elf suit, but I cut out the sleeves to make it look a little bit more DIY. And then I added a mohawk just to give it that punk effect. For actually making the mohawk, I took some garden foam and cut them into triangular prisms. And I was going to cover it with hair from a wig that I had from a few years ago when I dressed up as Steve Aoki for a costume party. But then I just decided to cover everything with black duct tape. And then once I had the prisms ready, I used some green velvet, some felt, and some white pom-poms to basically make some mini hats to put on each of the 4 spikes. Lastly, I didn't film this, but I took the 4 spikes and I taped them onto a headband just so I could put it on my head and then they would stay together. For making the actual outfit, I used crushed green velvet because I thought actual green velvet would be a little bit too elegant for these purposes. And so what I did was I just traced out a sleeveless shirt that I already had, the front and the back, and then I sewed it together. With the pants, I cut out 2 rectangles and I added some curves at the side of each rectangle. And then I sewed those 2 rectangles together at the curve because that was basically the crotch seam. When I turned it so that the crotch seam was in the center, I joined the legs in the middle to create the actual pants in full. And then moving on to the collar, I basically cut out felt to look like, you know, the Pokemon Starmie? So like basically that, and I did that twice. And then I shaped some wire to match the shape of the collar and sandwiched the wire in between the 2 pieces of felt and glued all of that together. Then I top stitched the edges of the collar, then added some string at the back so I could tie everything together. Finally, I added some black foam and these cute Jack Skellington buttons that I found onto the tips of the collar. You had to shout out Nightmare Before Christmas somewhere in here. So overall, I think this looked pretty good for the same reasons as the Jack Frost looked pretty good. I think it was the accessories. So the platform shoes, the additional layers of black and white sleeves, and the chains that were pinned together using safety pins, that definitely added to the punk element. I maybe could have cleaned it up, but then would it really be punk? And moving on to Kamiko's fit. Kamiko has a pretty casual vibe, which obviously I didn't match at all. Basically, the Christmas influence here is just Krampus. And I think as a concept, because of the coloring, Krampus is also pretty Halloween. So overall, the dress has the Krampus horns, but then is a kind of Elizabethan gown. So for the horns, you know the drill. It's just wire, duct tape, and foam shaped together. And then I paper mache'd it and painted it over top. Then I made a pannier. So what that is something to add volume to the sides of your hips so that the dress will hang the way that you want it to dramatically. To do this, I cut out a large rectangle, a small rectangle, and 2 strips. Then I used the strips and folded the ends of the large rectangles over to make channels where things could be fed through. Then I inserted zip ties into 3 of the channels and I sewed everything shut so it kind of looked like a laundry basket. And then using the last channel, I inserted an ultra long piece of fabric that would essentially be a belt that you could tie at your waist. So putting on the pannier, it looks like 2 baskets on the side of your hips and it works to fill out the gown. For the actual skirt, I cut out a few meters of black satin, folded it in half, and sewed all of that together. Then I folded one side a few inches over to make a channel that you could feed an elastic through, fed that elastic through using a safety pin, and that side became the waist. And then the other side was left open and flowy as the bottom of the gown, so it kind of ended up looking like this. Moving on to the shirt, I should have basically done the same thing that I did for the skirt skirt so that there would just be a long piece of fabric that you sewed together, and then you thread an elastic through at the top so that you could put it through your arm, you could put it through your upper body. But what I actually did was something super weird, and I joined the armholes into the top somehow. I don't really even understand how I did this, but it worked. But still, overall, this looked pretty good. I definitely think it could have been a little bit more refined, maybe adding some roses to the chest line and doing something a little bit more with that area if I had time. But moving on to why I didn't have time, which was Haidao's dress. So Haidao has a pretty feminine vibe, to be honest. She's tried a lot of different colors of hair. She's had so many cool different frames for her glasses. One thing I wanted to help her explore was dramatic trains, flowy. And so basically what we did was take Mrs. Claus and combine that with Rihanna's Met Gala gown. I don't even know if there's a Halloweeny vibe to this outfit, but you know, there's always that one girl that looks amazing at the party, and she didn't fit the theme at all, but she really stood out, and she won still. That is Haidao's look. This dress is basically like Rihanna's Met Gala gown, except for the fact that the actual train itself is red and the fur lining is white. I don't know if you remember, but in 2015, everyone was memeing Rihanna when she wore this dress and was like, ha ha, you look like a pizza. So she is the cheese, and Haidao is now the sauce and the crust. Let me tell you how I made this pizza. I preheated the oven to 450. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I did a lot of Googling and experimenting to get the shape and the pattern for the bottom part. When I got this, I cut out the 6 different pattern pieces on red satin and then in white cotton for the lining. And I sewed all of the pieces of the satin together, pieces of the lining together, and then I sewed the satin and the lining together to basically create, like, you remember that game you played in elementary school? I basically made that. Now, this is a pretty beautiful dress, but I had not brought the lining together at the waist because I wanted to add a band. But I cut out 2 rectangular strips and I sewed them together. Then I pinned that and sewed that into the top of the skirt so that it was complete. And basically you could just add an elastic there or even a ribbon in there as you needed to hold up the weight of the dress. For the top, it's basically the same as the Krampus dress where I did it wrong, but it ended up working super good. Again, I would have just made the tube top and the sleeves separately and added an elastic at the top of each piece to make sure that they stayed put, but you live and you learn. Then I added some faux fur. So for the coat, I cut out some faux fur in the shape of a rectangle with like a bit of a divot. Basically, the ends are where the coat joins at the back, and the front is slightly shorter just to give the dress a bit of dimension and shape. Then I cut the same pattern in white cotton for the lining, and I sewed it all together at the top and the bottom. Lastly, I whip stitched the ends and joined the ends together at the back entirely using some more stitches. The cuffs were essentially the same process, but with small rectangles. Basically, a fur piece, a lining, sewed together at the top and the bottom, and then joined together on the sides. But afterwards, I sewed the cuffs onto the sleeves, so then we were done with the top. The last part was to attach the fur to the dress. So the first thing I did was measure the entire perimeter of the dress, and that came to about 320 inches. Then I cut 6 12 by 60 inch strips, and I joined them all together to create a super long row of fur. And then I pinned and sewed the long fur strip into the perimeter of the dress. Obviously, there was a little bit of extra, so I needed to join the fur at the front by hand stitching everything and then trimming off any excess. So at this point, the dress looked like this. Obviously, there was a little bit of rippling, so I resolved that by hand stitching the ends of the fur back into the dress. I'm not entirely sure why this worked, but holy crap, it took so long. I think like literally 8 hours. But in the end, it looked pretty damn good. And then the last thing I did was add a belt by taking a bow from the dollar store apart and trimming off the gold edges. Really went from high quality to low quality there. But this literally slapped. The shape and the train were pretty successful, and it was a lot of hard work, but it looked super elegant and it actually resembled Rihanna's garment to an extent. Overall, making all these costumes was a ton of work, but I think it paid off, right? I don't know. It was super fun to see everyone in the costumes, and it was a lot of fun to make them. I hope you enjoyed the video, and let me know which one was your favorite. Hopefully you can like, subscribe, and maybe even turn on the bell notifications. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and remember, go big, be larger than life, be XL.